In your campaign, is it an act of mercy to kill the wounded? I'll talk about that in this video. At one time, actually not so long ago, it was merciful to kill the wounded. That was one of the jobs that was given to the low-ranking officer, what we would call a lieutenant today, that they would have to go out and put the wounded out of their misery, because if they couldn't drag themselves off the battlefield, odds are that they would not survive. And even many of those who did drag themselves off the battlefield would die, because it was medicine just didn't have the ability to handle the infections, and they didn't understand diseases and germs and things like that. So when you place your campaign in a medieval-like setting, or an ancient or whatever type setting, fantasy type setting, you have to think about what is the average person like with healing. Now, your characters, you go to the healer and they heal you and so on, but is that available to everyday people? If it does, then life expectancy goes up and so on, but it's a very different kind of world. So if you're basing your world on something medieval-like or fantasy or Tolkien-esque, it's a bit different. Consider Bilbo was stabbed with a sword. Now, true, it was a sort of one of the Nazgul, but what happens that he nearly died and he was scarred for life, and it would always bother him for the rest of his life, the fact that he was stabbed. And that was where he was stabbed, not in the abdomen, because if it punctures your intestines, you're basically done for, because you would get your own excrement would be throughout the wound, and cleaning that was so difficult, and that they just really didn't survive. I mean, there are stories about people getting hit with arrows, and how, if the arrow was in the arm or whatever, you'd pull the arrow out or push the arrow through, and then you would cauterize the wound to stop the bleeding by burning. But that was actually perhaps even more modern than than you would actually place in some campaigns. So you have this interesting question: is it merciful? Today we think, oh, they're going out and killing the wounded. That's a war crime. But at one point in time, it was merciful. I know that I've seen some discussion that in the U.S. Civil War, which is in 1863, 64, in that time frame, that it was a question: do you kill the wounded or not? Because many of them wouldn't survive, and you don't want to see somebody suffer if they've got a wound that is going to fester and just drain them from the infections that set in. That's cruel. When you know that the person is going to die from the wound, you would off them. Look at the movie The Highlander. At the very beginning, he was driven out of the village because he suffered a wound that they knew was fatal. Now, they didn't cover that in as much detail as some other ones, but I did a little bit of research looking through this, and there was the one where the guy they're seeing the blood trail, and they find where the arrow of the person they're tracking, that they pulled the arrow out, and the guy picks it up and smells and tastes the blood, and he can tell that it's blood from an internal organ, that basically the something has punctured probably the intestines, and just from the sour bile taste that would come from that. And he goes, oh, we don't need to follow him anymore. He's not going to live. He's going to die. And maybe somebody will put him out of his misery, but maybe they won't. But it's a very different perspective than what we have today. We see people today with a very high survival rate where from combat, where people lose their limbs, people lose their arms. We've seen pictures of people who survived horrible accidents because medicine has advanced. Though there is some interesting discussion about the Romans having some advances in medicine, but some of that knowledge wasn't widely distributed and sort of got lost in the Middle Ages. So you have to figure out one of the things you should decide in your campaign is what is the level of medicine and knowledge? Is it only with healers and is only magical healing? If so, what happens to someone who is out farming, and something happens and they get a major gash? Luckily, maybe it's just their arm gets cut. It may take them a long time to get to a healer. So what happens? Do they survive? Do they die from the horrible infection? Do they go to Sawbones and have the arm amputated? I like the scene in Black Sails, which was on there, where the one guy, they break his leg so badly, and the guy goes, there's no way. He says he's going to die if we don't amputate the leg. And you see that scene where you have to amputate the leg, or you have to do horrible things, what we consider today. I didn't particularly care for the movie Master and Commander, particularly if you compare it to some other things like the Horatio Hornblower series, which is much better, both the movies and the books. But there's the scene, at least in the movie of Master and Commander, where there's the guy who's been hit in the head or wounded in the head, and you have to remove part of the skull and dig the bullet out and so on, and it's done out in the open. We think of surgical techniques today, and it's, but they didn't do that just that long ago. And if you place your campaign in a fantasy setting, what is the likelihood of somebody surviving or knowing what to do? And how prevalent are healers? Do you only have a town priest who can maybe do a cure light, but you've got to get into town to do that? And if you're like a lot of people, it says you're 5-10 miles from town, because you came into town infrequently, you lived self-sufficient out on the farm, so you've got to come into town for healing. And maybe by the time you get there, they're dead, or that the infection has spread, or various things. These are questions that you need to think about, and it can give your campaign a very different view. And it's like this discussion about, do you kill the wounded after a battle? Is that being evil, or is that being merciful? Those are questions that depend upon the healing level or the knowledge of medicine in your campaign. Going and killing the wounded could be an act of mercy. If you like my video, press the thumbs up button. I'd appreciate that. Or if this interests you, you can always subscribe to my channel. There's a button right above. I look forward to hearing some comments. Tell me what you think about this, and I'll try and reply, and we can see if I'll do some more of these. Thank you.